Thank you so much for your introduction and for inviting me today. Okay, so I'm just going to move this little screen sharing thing. It's covering my text. Can you see that? I don't know. Anyway, that's okay. So just a little bit of context first. So agricultural practices in Sudan have been changing rapidly over the last century, and especially since the mid-20th century. So some of the main reasons for this are the replacement of the water wheel by diesel pumps between the 1950s and 70s along the Nile. And alongside this, at the same time, an increased introduction of commercial crop varieties, especially from the 1970s onwards. And then since then as well, the reduction of the annual flood since the completion of the Merowe Dam. And before that, the flood was a major sort of time in the agricultural calendar. And the river still does flood today, but just to a much lesser extent. So for example, in this profile of Annetta Island here, the sloping riverbanks are still flooded, but the upper riverbank, that stretch up until the palm tree, would flood in the past, but doesn't today. So some of these sort of major changes with the irrigation and the crop development, are quite obvious and well known, and to some extent documented. But what is less clear, it's sort of clear visually how rapidly agricultural practices are changing, but how are things actually happening at a sort of local scale with sort of local crops and practices. So that was a real kind of focus of the study. But some broader research context. So Tomomi introduced some of the sort of research projects. So initially I was working as an archaeobotanist at Amara West, and it was during the time there that we sort of came up with the idea for writing a broader application to also look at the changing contemporary agriculture. So in the archaeobotanical research at Amara West, we were looking at the agricultural practices at a second millennium BC town. So Amara West was an ancient island town during the Pharaonic period. And in the picture in the left, you can see Annetta Island in the background, and that's where the archaeological team stays during fieldwork, and was a real kind of focus for the ethnobotanical work. So yeah, following this, then had the project Sustainability and Subsistence Systems in a Changing Sudan. And the broader aim of this was to investigate recent and ancient crop histories and through the lens of thinking about agricultural risk management. And so the components of this then were so the ethnobotany and oral histories of Nubian agriculture, and then to contextualize this with the long-term past through archaeobotanical sources, which was basically, I was still carrying on with archaeobotanical work at Amara West, but then sort of contextualizing those results with other already published data from other sites, and also looking at archival sources. And then following this project, we had a follow-on connected project to co-produce a community-orientated book. So the idea for that obviously came up in the previous project. And one of the key reasons was because these sort of it became clear that these local kind of agricultural histories are little documented, very much in the memories of elderly farmers, and now endangered. And then following this in 2019, I managed to get back for an extra field season to kind of expand the research to also look at wild plant uses. So for like a kind of holistic view of all of the different sorts of wild and domesticated plant uses. And this slide introduces some of my key project collaborators through these different projects, especially Mohammed Hassan, Mohammed Saad, and then also Maha Kordofani, who helps with the plant identifications, and Adam Bashir, who joined in the last field season looking at the wild plants. So in the ethnobotanical interviews, so I'm just struggling to see all of my screen here. So the ethnobotanical interviews, we were focused on talking to farmers about crops grown, their uses and relative importance. And those interviews were sort of semi-structured and qualitative, but where we were definitely trying to have a little subset of questions that were a little bit repetitive, so we could get to some semi-quantified comparison between today and the past. And so we were asking farmers about their crops grown and uses and relative importance today, but then also asking elderly farmers those same questions for the early to mid 20th century. And we managed to get back to predominantly the 1950s, but with some elderly farmers back to the 1940s. And then we were also asking farmers about cultivation practices, where and how they're growing different crops at the time of year, the different kind of soil categories, the crop processing methods, so from like harvesting through to threshing, sort of winnowing, storage, and then post-storage in the home, from grinding to cooking. And food uses, and that aspect of food uses was something that got explored a lot more when we were working on the community book. And then for all of these categories, changes in living memory. And we were especially focused on Annetta Island, as I mentioned, in the nearby small regional town of Abri, in the Sukoot region. But we did also visit other areas for a much more limited range of questions, but to try and get some comparison and see if there were any particular differences regionally. So my click's not changing the screen. Right, there we go. So I just added this extra map really quickly to show some of the other areas in red that we also visited for some of the interviews with farmers. And then I also like showing this map as well, because the Google Earth image shows more than any other map this sort of transition between the hyper-arid regions to where it starts to get a little bit greener. So the study region only has very, very minimal to negligible summer rainfall. So agriculture is entirely reliant on the Nile. So a part of research, of course, was collecting the plants. When you're doing ethnobotanical research, you always have to collect plants and deposit them in a herbarium, and then they're there as a reference to go back to check identifications if you need to, and also because in botany the taxonomy of plants is often changing, so it keeps that kind of baseline record. And similarly, it's important to document all the different kinds of local plants, specifically local plant names for crops, because sometimes the local categorizations can group plants differently. And it was very useful to document plant names in local Nubian and Arabic, because some of the Nubian words were very specific. So for example, lubia was quite a confusing name sometimes for the interviews, because it could be used for about 3 different bean crops, whereas in Nubian it was always specific names. And it had the same when recording food names as well, but I'll show some of those shortly. So in documenting the sort of agri practices and food practices. One complexity was that some practices are still persisting, and then others that have stopped already were just in the memories of older farmers. So, for example, people still, well, in household farms anyway, harvesting by hand, and there's some post-storage crop cleaning. But for example, the picture of grinding sorghum, that was just a demonstration and is very rare today. Mills were introduced from the 1940s and 50s onwards, and then grinding stones used pretty infrequently, and most households don't use them at all. But even when you see some post-storage crop cleaning, like in the bottom, it's still a bit different than in the past. A, because some different crops are being grown, but B, critically the stage of threshing is now using a threshing machine, not with donkeys, and that completely changes the range of crop weeds and detritus that you get. And the relevance of that is especially for archaeobotanists who, from an ethno-archaeological perspective, with some traditional practices, you might collect the crop remains that are produced at different stages, and then you can use that to help understand your archaeobotanical remains in terms of what kind of detritus gets created by different kinds of processing practices. But as soon as you have some of those processes altered by things like threshing machines, then those components in all the other subsequent stages are also altered. So learning about the past practices was like another subset of interviews. So elderly farmers describe how they'd use the shadu for the sagaya, the older forms of irrigation in the past, and how threshing for example, threshing with donkeys. It just reminded me, with the threshing with donkeys, an interesting thing when we were working on the community book, and a big component of that was talking to people to come to a consensus on what to include and how to describe things. And threshing with donkeys caused a problem for a bit, because some people said we only thresh with 6 or 7 donkeys, and then in some other conversations, people would correct that and say, no, it was at least 15 donkeys. And eventually we realised that the difference was between a netta and then on the main riverbank, and the reason being simply space. So in the area for threshing would be more restricted on the island, so you had 6 or 7 donkeys. But on the main riverbank, you could have threshing areas in some wider open spaces, and then sometimes that could be up to 15. But that is an example of the kind of narrative that needed to be negotiated when sort of writing the book and having a text that everyone agreed with. So I mentioned that we were talking about crops, cultivation and land use. This was especially a predominant topic in some early interviews, so we could really understand, when we said to someone, what crop are you growing and why, we'd also say, and where are you growing it? And this helped to really frame as well how cultivation was changing over time, and that really threads very closely with this change of the annual, the dimension of the annual flood. So the lower sloping riverbank areas and this big inland stretch of upper riverbank is the area that altogether used to be flooded, and that would be called Saluka land, and the crops grown in that particular season in that area, Saluka crops, and that was, as I mentioned, a really key part of the annual year, agricultural cycle, but that whole upper riverbank now is fixed land and irrigated all year with the diesel pumps, and it's just that lower riverbank land, like you can see in the picture in the top left, that retains that like a microcosm of the older practices. So I don't want to show too many graphs, but it's useful just to show a couple to highlight this change in crops grown today versus the mid-20th century. So we were really focused on cereals and pulses. We did inventory all of the different crops grown, but for some of the more repetitive interviews, we just focused on the cereals and pulses as major kind of subsistence crops. And then also from the archaeobotanical perspective, it's this category of crops that are particularly useful to then track back in the long-term past, because those are the sorts of seed crops that preserve in the archaeological record. So the plot shows in pale green the percent of farmers growing different crops in the mid-20th century, and then in darker green, the present day. I think the clearest difference on this plot initially to see is in the cereals. So there were more farmers growing, well, all the farmers were growing whole barley and sorghum in the mid-20th century, and fewer of them are today. And then you can see slightly odd colours and stripy plots I have by wheat, because that was a crop that just didn't neatly fit into this mid-20th century versus present day plot like the rest of the different crops, because it was specifically introduced to Annetta Island around the mid-1950s. And then they stopped growing it just locally in 2015 due to bird attacks. But so prior to its introduction, whole barley was the main winter cereal, and then wheat essentially rapidly displaced it, being grown more or less at the same time. And then sorghum and pearl millet, well, sorghum especially can be grown throughout the year, but it was a really important summer crop, and it basically started to be grown less over time because essentially a few different reasons, but one of which the cost of diesel. We've basically introduced a new cost, and it started to make cultivation in the summer more expensive. And then also when fewer farmers grew it over time, by the 2000s, people also started to find that their crop, the grains were being eaten by birds. So basically when you have wider, and this was the problem for wheat as well, when you have really wide areas of crop being grown at the same time, the same variety ripening at the same time, it would mitigate against the bird attacks. But when people started to grow more varieties of wheat, harvesting them at different times, and more patchy bits of sorghum, then the system of bird attack mitigation breaks down. So that has in the end been a kind of unintended consequence of agricultural practices changes, and some of the reasons these crops have been grown less often as food crops. You'll still see sorghum being grown, but with the grains being eaten, rather the whole plant is collected and fed to animals. And the uses are, so these plots show the changing uses over time, which basically just breaks down the previous plot into a little bit more detail, showing that essentially more crops were being grown as food crops, and then today some of these crops are being grown less for food, more for fodder, and instead there's also now more crops being grown to sell. So it's like a shift in the priority basically of which crops are being grown and for which purposes. And particularly aside from wheat becoming a main commercial crop, the other main commercial crop that increased a lot in terms of the amount of space being used to grow them, was broad beans, and that is really the predominant crop you can see growing in the landscape today. So this is examples of some of the local crops that were grown by most farmers as food crops, like key food crops in the mid-20th century, that are now grown less for food today, sometimes just in small patches or more for animals, or in some cases not at all. So I thought it was useful to show the pictures, because I know some people aren't familiar with what, say, pearl millet and sorghum look like, especially. And then also the pulse crops on the right, lab and cowpea. And a lot of farmers are still growing these crops, but the difference now is it's in small patches, like you can see in this picture of the riverbank, whereas in the past they would be grown in sort of really wide field areas. So all of those different crops could be grown together in these sorts of riverbank areas, initially after the river goes down around September, October, but actually all the way through to the next summer. So this photo is taken in around February time, and so that's several months after the river has been low again. So all of these crops are being planted here without any extra irrigation or fertilizer, and they're essentially all just growing because they're locally adapted varieties with root systems long enough to reach the water table. So just to highlight a couple of these older crops in decline, hulled barley are now gone from the most important winter food crop to an almost forgotten food crop. Characteristic of all of these older crops is stress tolerance, being fast growing. But a negative for hulled barley was that it was slow to process. So we were shown how to process these sorts of crops for food. And this is how they would do this in the past, not much today. But so here we're grinding some hulled barley, and so I just put this picture of a grain up on the upper right, because otherwise it's really hard to explain. So the grains have got this tightly infused lemma and palea chaff, and so to remove that, they would grind it, and then you can see in the sieve on the right that these little bits of papery chaff actually separate out from the flour, so then they just sieve it out. But that sieving process could be up to 8 times, so it was just basically quite time consuming. Sorghum, obviously a really important crop in Sudan today, but in the north, growing it as a food crop had declined partly because of this expense of the diesel, versus the more cheap to produce sorghum in rain-fed areas, than this issue of bird attacks. But like hulled barley, it has these resilient characteristics of being fast growing and heat tolerant, and actually also that you can have different varieties that you could grow at different times of year. And lab, which is my favorite crop, I guess. And likewise, this was described as possibly the most important food pulse crop in the mid-20th century locally, but is now an almost forgotten food pulse, better known as a fodder crop. And it's definitely the most resilient and arid tolerant crop out of the whole range of crops. It can grow well at any time of year, and for a pulse it's particularly useful because you can eat it green or dried, and you think about it then, because you could grow it at almost any time. It's a pulse that you could just eat, a bit like you eat peas or broad beans green, and it's an interesting pulse because it keeps flowering, and then you can harvest it several times. So farmers described that you could harvest it up to 4 times, and then the last time you take the whole plant and feed it to animals. For archaeobotanical perspective, it's interesting looking at some of these different ways that you could process or eat these pulses, because I think it reflects reasons why you might not always find quite as many of them as you would expect in the archaeobotanical record. So, for example, if you're eating some of these crops boiled and green and they haven't been dried first, they're not really going to survive very often in the archaeological records through charring. So in contrast to some of these suites of crops becoming like from major crops to minor crops, we have other crops coming in the other direction from minor to major crops, particularly broad beans, which obviously have a longer history of being grown, but the variety that was grown previously was really small. And in contrast, then we've got the larger developed varieties and agri-developed varieties, so modern varieties that were released from the 1980s onwards. I think the crop development started before that in the 70s. But then these larger varieties are more, good to sell, preferred by restaurants and things like that. So obviously advantages of broad beans that they're commercial, so you could sell them for more than some of the other crops, and obviously they're a key part of the contemporary traditional food culture. And the negative part is dependent on a cold December and intensive irrigation. And similarly with bread wheat, the positives being that they're commercial and part of the modern traditional food culture. But again, they can only be grown in the winter months and need intensive irrigation. And in the local context, they had the problem of the bird attacks, so haven't been growing them since 2015, though it's still grown widely throughout the north, obviously, and wheat is one of the most focused crops for cultivation in Sudan. But here's a picture of the bird attack problem in 2014 that completely destroyed the crops. So in parallel to these changing crops, some changes in foodways. So farmers described that although flatbreads are still commonly eaten today, they would be eaten more frequently in the past, and that flatbreads were more common today in Annetta than on Abri. And then another big difference was the range of ingredients. So when more different range of crops were being grown as food crops, there was also a much wider range of ingredients being used in the flatbreads, whereas today they're more commonly made from sorghum, wheat and occasionally maize. And there was more sorts of categories of flatbreads described in the past as well. So for example, there is one made from pearl millet that was used for travelling, that's no longer made today, and more varieties of the thicker flatbreads. So for example, one that was made with sorghum and sometimes also with dates and milk. Here is a picture of breakfast on Annetta, showing some of these different flatbreads today, the sorghum thin crepey sort of flatbread kisra and the thicker gurasa. So in parallel is an increase in baked wheat bread, where wheat is particularly used for baked bread. It has different baking properties with the gluten content, and also, and these are now eaten daily. So I've got a picture of a bread oven in the top left, this called foreign, and actually a lot of these are not used today, but interestingly, some families describe these as being more commonly used from the mid-20th century onwards, in parallel to sort of increase in baking wheat bread. But then they dropped out of use because instead it's now people more commonly buy bread from bakeries. And then similarly, porridge-like dishes, still eaten today, but less frequently, and in the past with a wider range of cereals and also pulses, and also with some types not being used today. For example, these ones with boiled squash and milk and sugar being more consumed in the past than today. And then also in parallel with changing crops and foodways as some of the associated material culture. So with the grinding stones being rarely used today, but actually also at least locally, the mills also being used less today. Being more occasionally used vernacular kitchens, here cooking different types of flatbreads. So an interesting note for archaeobotanists is the fuel types being used. So the kisra is being cooked with the fuel being used is palm fronds, so very fast burning, but quite ephemeral. Will just leave a kind of light ash that would be quite hard to find in the archaeological record, or not be as obvious as like a really like you know, sort of more clear kind of charcoal deposit. And here's one of these bread ovens again that's no longer used today. And this is actually from the house we stay in on Aneta Island. And likewise, one of the cereal mills that was being used in the earlier years I visited, but not in the last year, in parallel to this decrease in growing wheat. And now typically bread is bought from these bakeries, and also flour from the shops. So when people are not growing wheat and sorghum for food on their own farms, they're buying it instead. And in parallel as well, a decrease in traditional storage. So very few households we visited still use these today. Crops are stored more commonly in sacks. And this is a picture of seed saving. It's a really important topic, I think, for thinking about changing crops and diversity, because it's this process of seed saving that keeps old varieties and land races alive. So very briefly, a deep time perspective with the archaeological context compared to the contemporary study. The crops that were really important in the mid-20th century all have a record of being important in the archaeological past as well. So just as key examples, things like hulled barley, key crops, the key crop from the Neolithic up to the 1960s, and then sorghum, lablab and cowpea for the last sort of 2000 years until recent decades. And those crops, sorghum, lablab and cowpea, are all crops that are, can be important crops in the summer months. So overall, growing crops through the winter and summer together was a risk management strategy from the first millennium BC up until the 1980s, when instead the focus has shifted heavily to the emphasis on the winter crops. And this Google Earth image, you can see in green how much of the island is being cultivated in the winter months. And then in contrast, the small patches being cultivated in the summer. And farmers described that all of this area used to be cultivated year round. So this recent and ancient past can provide a kind of deep time perspective on some of today's local crops and about their environmental suitability, which obviously is really important to think of now in terms of which crops could be resilient in future climate change. But this sort of local historic crop diversity, the actual crops themselves, and the associated knowledge of how to grow them, how you might eat them, are all endangered. So producing the community orientated book was trying to think of all of these different aspects together, from crops and cultivation being both cultural heritage, as well as information about agricultural resilience. That would be sort of practical, sort of local knowledge. And then through this context of these sorts of local crop diversity and local crop histories being little documented, and currently in the memories of elderly farmers but being endangered. And this is actually a kind of parallel topic for changing agri-systems in many different contexts and countries, because these really sort of fundamental modernizing changes in industrialized agriculture, with sort of the release of modern cultivars that are dependent on heavy irrigation and fertilizer, is something that's accelerated globally since the 1960s. And regionally, in Sudan and elsewhere, the focus on these new developed crops has meant that there's a less focus on what's happening to the original local and subsistence crops, and the changes and the diversity, and how to use them little recorded. So the book aimed to try and be a documentation of local oral agricultural histories for future generations, as a means to distribute research findings to local communities directly, because obviously normal publication routes don't always achieve that, and sort of trying to explore a way of maintaining local knowledge of agrobiodiversity and food crops. So one sort of fieldwork was especially dedicated to this, but it was, initially based on the prior interviews. So we basically made a draft before fieldwork, and commissioned some of the illustrations to try and capture some of the things that you can't capture in a photograph anymore. And those were based on finding archival images as a basis. And then during the fieldwork, having the draft in hand meant that could basically then talk to people that we'd interviewed in the past, and additional families as well, to check the content, add new content, refine content, check images, take new photographs, and work on the layout, refine the translations and transliterations, had some stages of editing with the local primary school teachers. I learned how to use InDesign before, so I could do the layout in the field, and then printed the book in Khartoum, and then returned to distribute it locally. So the distribution was focused on Annetta and Avery, all of the people that we had met, and sort of other households locally in the local community widely, and especially in schools. And then also some visits to other areas as well, and also to different sorts of institutions in Khartoum. So I did write the book in a mind of being multi-generational, and also suited to different kinds of audiences and readers. So locally, from a multi-generational perspective, so it was obviously to suit school contexts and younger generations, but then also to be of interest to older generations as well, because it was the stories, especially from elderly farmers. So I just have a few images from the booklet. So for example, some components of it basically had little narratives about different crops. how they're cultivated and different uses. It was very focused on different images, and on the older and contemporary crop processing stages. Also some other aspects, like we were trying to document Nubian agricultural songs. Actually, we didn't manage to document that much in the end, because not many people remembered the words in Nubian anymore. And then a section at the end also had a few pages on summarising the archaeobotanical work at Amara West, and also a page that sort of summarised that in a longer term crop histories from some other sites as well. Some little components on the ancient bread ovens and grinding stones and crops. And some images here of distributing the book locally, that was led by Mohammed Hassan in the top left. And in the schools, it was for primary and secondary, where Mohammed would explain the book contents. Thank you.